Okay, so mechanoreception, of course, begins with mechanoreceptors. You got to have specialized sensory neurons, specialized sensory afferents that have evolved adaptations so that they can respond to, for example, tactile deformation or mechanoreception, with a volley of action potentials, right? And like signal the brain that you have touched. So there's several different forms of mechanoreceptor that can respond to different types of mechanoreception, and they're embedded in the skin, which is the largest organ in our bodies. And sometimes, it's the depth at which they are found that has an influence over, what type of information they're going to be able to detect. For example, very light touch, versus sort of deeper, kind of poking sort of touch, right? And so the Meissner's corpuscle is a very critical kind of mechanoreceptor that's essential for our detection of light touch. And it has a specialized, of course, adaptations, like structural adaptations. It has in the ending, the sort of, remember, these are all pseudo-unipolar cells, right? But the pole that goes out, into the periphery, the tip of it has these protein receptors that are expressed in these Meissner's, corpuscle cells that actually are like they can twist open with pressure. So if you touch, you actually deform, these proteins in the membrane that allow for sodium to pass through and thus allow for depolarization and the initiation of an action potential. And the endings of these Meissners are surrounded by what's called a corpuscle. So it's like a series of membranous layers that like an onion that kind of goes around the end of that neuron, of that afferent, projection. And so it sort of surrounds it at the tip here. And these layers, there's like lots of ions, rich in ions in there. So when you press, you deform the corpuscle, push the ions towards the membrane of the Meissners, swing open those channels and allow for depolarization and the initiation of an action potential. Now, the Meissner's corpuscles are really interesting because we have a lot more of them when we're younger, and then we tend to lose a great many, as we age. But during development, we're actually getting very fine, touch detail, about things. Particularly, they're found in very high concentration in the glabrous or hairless skin, the hands and feet and the face and things like that. So there's another kind of receptor that looks a lot like a Meissner's, but it's often referred to by folks who study somatosensation as a separate type of mechanoreceptor. And its input is going to travel largely in a different set of cables, from the body to the brain, because it has much more emotional salience to us than just, sort of light touch. And that is something called the end bulb of Krauss. And it's found, kind of densely packed into, areas around like the nipples and the genitals and, specific areas. So it's carrying a different form of emotionally significant touch, basically. And it's going to be, we'll see, going up a different column of cabling, in our spinal cord, and will largely end up in a different, cortical arrival site, basically in the brain. But the Meissner's is definitely part of this mechanoreceptive input along what we call the dorsal column system. One of the important thing about the Meissner's is that they tend to respond upon the initial, touch, the initial light touch. So there's like this rapid volley of action potentials when you first make contact, but then it drops off rather rapidly. So that's called a fast adapting receptor, a fast adaptive receptor. And we're going to see other receptors may continually fire all the time as long as the stimulus is present. But this adapts quickly to the initial touch. It also tends to set off a volley of action potentials that also adapt rapidly when you remove the touch. So these Meissner's corpuscles, which are a component of mechanoreception, carried, we're going to see, by the dorsal column system, are basically in the upper layers of the skin, very sensitive to very light touch, but adapt quickly to that touch. They fire upon the initial engagement with whatever it is you're touching, and then also when you remove your finger, or the corpuscle from whatever you're touching. There's another kind of fast adaptive receptor that's called the Puccinian corpuscle, and this is located deeper in the skin, deeper in the dermal layers than the Meissners. And it's responsive to sort of deeper sort of touch. So if you just lightly touch, that is a very particular character, but if you more deeply touch, that's a different set of mechanoreceptors called the Puccini corpuscles, and they're deeper in the skin. I often think of them as like the poke. They respond to poke, and they adapt fast also, just like the Meissners. They fire upon the initial, but then sort of stop, and then they fire upon the removal. Then there are what are called the Ruffini's corpuscles, and if you grip the table, right? If you grip if you're sitting at your kitchen table or something, and you grip your table, you can feel there's like this stretch sense, like that grip sense, and this is not a fast adaptive response because you really don't want to be gripping onto something and holding onto something and then have it fade away, right? In terms of the firing. So these Ruffini's corpuscles tend to fire consistently. They're what we call slow adaptive receptors. And then there are what are called Merkel's receptors, and these detect vibration and texture, and they're found very high up in the skin layers. They're slow adapting also, like the Ruffini's corpuscle, and each ending of these particular mechanoreceptors consists of a Merkel cell in sort of close apposition with an enlarged nerve terminal. So there's kind of an interesting, like kind of physiological organization of this of these mechanoreceptors. They're kind of distributed over an area. There's something that's called a Merkel cell neurite complex or a Merkel disc receptor, and a single afferent can branch to basically innervate about 90 of these endings. So it allows you to get input over a broader area. So these are called Merkel's receptors, and they're really important for sort of textural discrimination, for example, and for vibration sense. And then there are the proprioceptors, which are going to give you information about position, about body position, about what we call proprioception. And these include muscle spindle receptors. These are kinesthetic mechanoreceptors or proprioceptors, and they're located in muscle, and they measure the stretch of the muscle, and they kind of serve that limb position sense or proprioception. And then there are what are called the Golgi tendon organs, which are also kinesthetic mechanoreceptors. They're also in muscle, but they're linked to tendons, so they give you more information about joint position. And they're also sensitive to the force generated by contraction. So they may help sort of map the effort that's being expended by muscle contraction. And again, identify sort of joint position.